I wonder if you remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about paradox and I set some homework. I wonder if you remember what it was. It was to see if you could find the other paradox in Matthew chapter 11. So we concentrated a few weeks ago on the very end, the last 5 verses, and we saw that there were a number of paradoxes in those few verses. But I said earlier in the chapter there was another paradox, and it is this. It was verse 11 of chapter 11 of Matthew where Jesus is talking about John the Baptist, and he says, "Assuredly I say to you, among those born of women, there has not risen one greater than John the Baptist. But he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he." So there's that other paradox in that chapter. We're going to hold on to that paradoxical perspective today as we talk about, or begin to talk about, the 5 solas of Protestant Christianity. And we're going to begin with the first one, which is Sola Gratia. Now, I wonder, has anybody heard of the 5 solas of Protestant Christianity? Is it familiar? No, I didn't think so. And I'll just give you a little bit of background to it. So here they are. They're all Latin phrases. Sola Gratia, Sola Fide, Sola Christus, Sola Gloria, Sola Scriptura. Now, sola means alone or only. And from that you can probably guess the rest. Sola Gratia, grace only, or grace alone. Sola Fide is faith, faith alone. Sola Christus should be easy, Christ, Christ alone. Sola Deo Gloria, the glory of God alone. Sola Scriptura, the scriptures alone. So that's what they are, and we're going to spend 5 services, I'm going to do it once a month, looking at each of these points. So today we're particularly going to look at the first one, Sola Gratia. But I just wanted to give you some background to this. So the 5 solas were not systematically articulated together until the 20th century. However, Sola Gratia and Sola Fide were used in conjunction by the reformers themselves. So if we talk about Martin Luther, and the people who were active in the Protestant church around his time, they did use those phrases, Sola Gratia, Sola Fide. And it says all of the solas show up in various writings by the Protestant reformers, but they are not catalogued together by any. So it's been brought together, these 5 phrases, over a period of time. Now, 1916, here are the meanings of those 5 phrases. Now, 1916, the Lutheran scholar Theodor Engelder published an article titled "The 3 Principles of the Reformation." And he included Sola Gratia, Sola Fide and Sola Scriptura in 1916. And then it was 1965 when those other 2, Sola Christus, Sola Deo Gloria, were brought together, and we suddenly have the 5 solas of Protestant Christianity. I want you to note that it's 1965. It's less than 60 years ago. So just be aware of that fact. Now, quoting from Wikipedia, it says this: in most of the earliest articulations of the solas, 3 were typically specified: Scripture over tradition, faith over works, and grace over merit. Each was intended to represent an important distinction compared with teachings claimed in Catholic doctrine. So what I want you to be aware of when we talk about these 5 solas is that whilst it's a convenient summary, an expression of Protestant theology, we have to be quite cautious about putting too much weight on these because they are a very late sort of formula together, brought together. And when we talk particularly about Swedenborg's work, of course, he's not aware of the 5 solas because we're talking about something that was brought together in 1965. However, he does deal with each of the different points, and he does talk about some of those alones. And he talks in particular about faith alone, which we'll look at next month. So it's a reasonably easy process and fairly straightforward to look at Swedenborg's work and see what how he understands these 5 phrases, even though he doesn't necessarily actually refer to those phrases word by word. And that's what we're going to do today. The other thing we need to remember is the context in which this was born. Because, as it says here, these phrases came about because they were opposing an existing doctrine. They were opposing what the Catholic Church taught at the time, saying, no, this is incorrect, this is false. We need to focus in another way. And that's also very important to remember when we consider these solas, these 5 phrases. The first thing I want to say from a Swedenborgian perspective, and the way Swedenborg deals with these, is the idea of being suspicious of the word alone. You see, it's never that simple. We have to be very, very careful. It's true that each of these phrases expresses something true, something that we ought to hang on to. But it doesn't mean that the opposite is entirely false, necessarily. You see, we have a tendency in our natural world, as we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, to think in black and white answers. We like very clean-cut, clear answers, and the truth rarely is. The truth is rarely black and white, simple, clear-cut down the middle. There's usually a grey area. There's usually something that we have to work our minds around to truly understand. And so when we talk about these phrases that say something alone, it's been necessary historically to oppose a falsity, but it's very, very easy to push it too far. And that's what I want to talk about particularly this morning. Now, here's what Swedenborg says. He says this: whenever a church exists, heresies arise in it as a consequence of people basing their thinking on one particular article of faith, to which they attach supreme importance. And he continues, for man's thought process is such that when he focuses his whole attention on any one matter, he makes more important than any other, especially so when delusions claim it as a discovery of his own. In that case, everything seemingly agrees with it and supports it, even to the extent of his being ready to swear to it when in fact it is false. So Swedenborg is very cautious about taking one principle in isolation and dealing with it as though it's the be-all and end-all. So that is a warning we need to just take on board. So I want to talk about grace. Now, Swedenborg is frequently misunderstood. He's misunderstood in this way. He's often thought of teaching that salvation is by merit, that you earn your way into heaven. That's a very common misconception, but it is a misconception. I know myself in talking to other Protestant Christians, it's very easy for them to get the impression that we're saying we earn our way to heaven, we earn our way into God's love. And that's not true. If you look at Swedenborg's work and you read it carefully, you see several times where he does two important things. One is this. He says this, "The Lord alone is righteous, since he alone is righteousness. And therefore, in the measure that a person receives good from the Lord, that is, in the measure that what composes the Lord's essential nature resides with him, he is righteous and has been justified." And you'll see many times Swedenborg says something like this, which emphasises the fact that salvation is from the Lord and that it is a gift. He also says this about merit. "There is the evil of self-merit, when a man ascribes good to himself and supposes that it is from himself, and on this account desires to merit salvation. This evil is signified in the internal sense by theft." So you can see Swedenborg does not promote the idea of merit, although it is easy for some to get that impression. And the reason it's easy for some to get that impression is because he doesn't dwell on grace alone. He includes it in a bigger picture, which is what I want to try and do this morning. So salvation is a free gift. We do not earn it. It is offered to us by the Lord. Nevertheless, every gift requires a response. A gift must be received. And that's an important thing to bear in mind. Even when we talk about this term grace, now we heard it in the reading several times, the reading that Videra brought us this morning. Grace is sometimes translated as favour. Okay? May I find grace in your eyes. May I find favour in your eyes. You see, what that does is it implies a power relationship. Okay? This is speaking to God and recognising that God is superior and higher than I am. And therefore I approach God and I seek His grace or I seek His favour. You see? So grace has within it the assumption that there is a power relationship, that one party is more powerful or more important than the other. Even when you consider the five alones, one of them is faith alone. Now, even the Protestant Christians will recognise that faith alone actually is the proper response to grace alone. You see, many people within the Christian church will say, well, yes, salvation is a gift of God. It is a free gift that is offered to us. But at the same time, they will say, you must have faith to accept the gift, you see. So faith becomes the response to the gift. And almost every Protestant Christian holds on to that idea. If you don't have that idea, if you don't recognise that this is a response here, then these two principles are mutually exclusive and contradictory. There's only one group that I'm aware of that says grace alone and kind of that's all, and they're called universalists. They are the people who say that everybody gets into heaven eventually. Doesn't matter what you've done, what evils you've performed or anything. Everybody goes to heaven eventually. But in that case, of course, it's not a free gift, it's compulsory. You have to go to heaven, irrespective of whether you want to be there or not. And that's the problem with universalism. Jesus said, freely you have received, freely give. You see, there's the response. Freely give. It's necessary to make a response to the gift. I wonder how many of you have one of these, a Gideon's International New Testament. When I was in high school, I remember there's one particular year level at high school. It might have been year 8, year 9, I can't remember which. But, you know, our whole year level was trooped into our school hall, and Gideon's International came and they spoke to the whole year level and they handed out these. And every student got a Gideon's New Testament and Psalms. Now the thing is, I remember, having received mine, what happened afterwards. So many of these ended their life, short life, in the bin. You see? So this was a free gift. This was given with no strings attached. And yet it was not received by 80, 90% of the people. So every gift must at least be received. And that reception depends on us. Do I wish to receive it? Now I want to talk about merit briefly, because merit is what is opposed in this Sola Gratia, faith, grace alone. Yes, we don't earn our way into heaven. Having said that, it is actually an important part of our development. So we have to be careful not to dismiss it too quickly. Who doesn't reward a child for good behaviour? We do. Everybody does. We reward a child for their good behaviour. We punish them if they don't do what they're supposed to. Why? Well, we do it because they need to learn how to behave. And on a very basic level, they need the reward and punishment arrangement to be able to understand. Otherwise, children run amok. I'm sure if you've tried to raise a child without reward and punishment, you would soon find out the error of your ways. So we go through a process of needing to learn the consequences of our actions, and so we use reward and punishment as one way to begin that process. But, of course, it's something that we must grow beyond. So, you remember that passage that I just read from Swedenborg before? This is the continuation. All who are being reformed at first suppose that good is from themselves, and therefore that by the good which they do, they merit salvation, as the result of their supposing that the good is from themselves. Okay? So all who are being reformed, note that, all who are being reformed. But he continues, but they who suffer themselves to be regenerated do not confirm this in their thought or persuade themselves that it is so, but the idea is gradually dissipated. For so long as anyone is in the external man, as is the case with all in the beginning of their reformation, he cannot do otherwise than think so, because he thinks solely from the external man. But when the external man, together with its desires and falsities, is being removed, and the internal man is beginning to work, that is, when the Lord flows in through the internal man with the light of intelligence and thereby enlightens the external man, the man then begins to believe otherwise and ascribe good not to himself, but to the Lord. So what I want you to do is hang on to the idea that salvation is a free gift. But I want you to understand also that whilst we do not merit, we do not earn our way into heaven, there is an important part of our development which means that we need to go through that experience of merit. We need to go through the idea of reward and punishment. And so if you look at the Gospels, you look at the Bible as a whole, you will find reward and punishment throughout it, because that is one of the states that we pass through in order to understand that ultimately grace, salvation, heaven is a gift. And the Lord speaks to all of our states, not only the ideal, but what is not ideal that we pass through on the way. Look, as a task for the week, what I'd like you to do is think about this habit of merit, of reward and punishment that we fall into. In what way do you expect to be rewarded for the good that you do? But try not to be too simplistic about it, and especially as you deal with others, especially as you deal with those who are less mature than you, children or whatever. Understand they go through that process of reward and punishment. They need it. It's part of their development. But just consider the way that you approach your own life and what you look for in what you do. When you do what is good, do you do it freely? Or do you do it expecting something? Do you do it with strings?